All right, guys, I'm Nicolette, and today Brian and I are here with Dave Hatter. He is a cybersecurity consultant with Intrust IT, and he's here to talk to us today about where software engineering and cybersecurity really come together. So we're excited, especially in our current times, to have this discussion. Thank you for joining us, Dave. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. I'm a nerd. What else could I talk about, right? I love this stuff.
Well, on that note, tell us how you got there. How'd you get to, tell us a little bit about
like, how'd you become a nerd, Dave?
I mean, come on, Brian, look at me. What else could I be?
Oh,
right?
I know the feeling.
So, yeah, I'm old enough to have grown up in the first, what I would call the golden era of video games, Atari, Magnavox, Odyssey, things like that. I've always loved games and computers. First computer I had was a Commodore 64. Again, the older people watching this will know what that is. Younger people are like, what? Commodore 64? But these were great game machines, did a little programming, was always interested in computers. And once I graduated from high school, decided that I was originally going to be a chemistry major. Ha, ha, ha. Did not do well in that and realized I would probably never graduate from college on that path. So floundered around for a while, tried a bunch of different things, and always sort of ended up coming back to, well, I like technology. It seems like technology is rising in business. Computers are, more in use and useful over time. Like, this seems like this might be a good career path. So transitioned into that while I was still in college and basically really enjoyed programming. I'm one of those weird nerds that actually likes to program. To me, it's kind of like solving a puzzle, right? Mm-hmm. And for me, there's a great sense of satisfaction being able to sit down with another human being. They tell me what they want, and I figure out how to make the computer do that. So I liked it. Graduated with a degree in information systems from NKU way back in the old days. I'm old enough to remember, I didn't work with them, but I'm old enough to remember things like punch cards. And data centers where there'd be people swapping tapes out and that sort of thing. DEC, PDP-11s, et cetera. So, went into the field.
Can you explain to Nicolette what punch cards are? Because I know she has no clue right now.
So for us real old timers back in the day, you would write your programs on these little cards by punching out holes. And the cards would go through a reader that would read those holes and translate that into a program. And then it's funny, I would talk to professors and so forth back. It's going to be like, oh, yeah, the big trick is you got to make sure and put a big X across the top of your cards. So when you're walking across campus and you drop them and they fly everywhere, you know how to put them back in the right order. So thankfully, I never had to do any of that sort of stuff. I did get to do fun things like use a 300 baud modem that would lose its connection all the time and work on terminals and that sort of thing. But, I kind of got into what I would describe as the golden age of desktop computing. PCs were a thing, DOS, Windows first came out, and, got a job as a professional programmer and have never looked back. I've been doing it for a long time and I love it.
I want to tell a funny story about punch cards. I have a good friend, Jose, who was a programmer, and he passed away, unfortunately. But he actually said when they were learning how to program and doing punch cards, what they would do is if they didn't like someone, they would actually mix their punch cards up.
Yeah, I can believe that, because that would be devastating trying to undo that, since you can't really just look at it and understand.
Right, what it is.
That's what, that's a really dirty trick.
Yeah.
That's mean.
Oh, Jose, bad.
Oh, Jose. Well, Dave, over those 30 years, since you've been around so long, how have you kind of seen the industry evolve?
Well, Nicolette, it's been really interesting because back in the old days, you had a lot of, data centers, mainframe type technology. When I first got into this, everything was sort of transitioning into the sort of three-tiered architecture, desktop computers rather than dumb terminals and that sort of thing. Products like Oracle, SQL Server, and that sort of thing were just starting to be implemented to build systems. Java became popular, and other, fourth generation languages like that. So, a major transition away from COBOL and mainframes, legacy type stuff, into these three-tier architecture, middleware type solutions, all running on the desktop. And then obviously over time, as the internet sort of became a commonplace thing for people and networking became more ubiquitous, I could get a network connection from just about anywhere. You started to see the transition into web-based apps, right? And web apps start to at least slowly replace some of these fat client desktop apps. And then within the last 10 years or so, we've seen more of a transition to apps, software for mobile devices, tablets, phones, that sort of thing. And, it's been really interesting because, we're sort of slowly, although it's more web-based now, slowly making the transition through all these cloud-based services like AWS or Microsoft Azure back into more of a centralized mainframe-like environment where all the computing power is no longer on the desktop. It's back out there somewhere in somebody's data center right now. Instead of what used to be your data center in the basement, now it's somebody's data center in the cloud. It's been really interesting to see over the last 3 decades this sort of almost go full circle, despite the fact that it's web-based now.
That's interesting. I never thought about it that way because all those dumb terminals that were out, like I guess that was probably like the late 90s, right?
Yeah.
Like you had all those, where people, nothing was on them. They were just able to like enter stuff or do really simple things. You're right. Basically, our computers are becoming dumb terminals where everything's being processed outside of it. That's it's pretty really crazy.
Like I said, when I first got into this, you would still see things like DEX or IBMs where people would be using terminal emulators and that sort of thing. And there was just one big mothership somewhere, right?
Right.
Then you saw the move to desktop computing, Windows, DOS, PCs, that sort of thing, where the applications were slowly being decentralized and running out on a desktop rather than in some data center somewhere. And over time, now we're sort of slowly going back to where the actual processing power is out in the cloud somewhere. And yeah, you might have an actual PC, but it's not really doing anything anymore, right? All the processing is happening out there in the cloud somewhere.
Yeah. Now that's interesting. Is that so? And I'm probably jumping on Nicolette's questions like way over them. Is that creating additional security risk right now that everything? I mean, so there's the security over where it's being processed, where all that data is stored, but then there's your machine, and now there's more transition, right? There's more pings or whatever to get it to where it is. In that transition, does it create more security risks than it previously did?
I don't know if it creates more. I think it creates different security risks and maybe less in some areas, but more in others. And I don't know that, if you really looked at it, I'm not sure it's not kind of a wash, but the risks are different.
Gotcha.
And I think that's one of the big problems that we on the software engineering side of this face is, so like when I went to college, security was never discussed. We never talked about how to write secure applications. And also in my spare time, I've been an adjunct instructor at Cincinnati State here in the greater Cincinnati area, teaching programming-related classes for well over 15 years. It's only been recently that that's something we've even really talked about with the curriculum, because again, so let me take a step back and I'll come back to this question. For me, for many years, on the software engineering side, before I sort of transitioned into a full-time cybersecurity role, I was really more interested in things like deadlines and budgets, right? Is the customer getting the functionality they want? Can I get it done when they want? Can I get it done in the budget that they want, right? And so while security was something I would think about, I wouldn't spend a lot of time on it. And if it came down to err on the side of security or err on the side of functionality, productivity, and time constraints, I would go with the latter, right? Because that's just, and generally the customers didn't care either. And I think that's the mindset many programmers, developers, engineers, whatever you want to call them, still have. And that's still the corporate mindset that's driving the software development in many cases. Now, I think in light of all these real high profile attacks we've seen, this is becoming more of a concern and people are paying more attention to it. But I will freely admit, like in my last job where I had a team of engineers reporting to me and I was doing development myself, I would be much more concerned about getting the software done by the deadline than the security around it necessarily. And we would have the security people from the security team, different set of people, coming and wanting to do things like, well, we need to install this tool that will remove your local admin permissions, and this tool will offset that, and you'll be able to do what you want. And be like, yeah, sure, I've heard this before. So they install it. You lose a couple of days of productivity because you can't do your job anymore. And, we would fight with these folks. And eventually I sort of got to the perspective of, these people really should be my ally. They know stuff that I don't know. At the end of the day, we really ought to focus on building software that not only is functionally adequate, but is secure as well. And, trying to bring them to the table sooner, trying to get their input sooner, trying to design the software to be secure as opposed to retrofit it in later. So I sort of over time shifted in my thinking from these people are the enemy. They're making me miss my deadlines. They're making me blow my budget to I really need them as an ally to help me figure out how I can deliver secure software. Because if I make the deadline, but the whole business goes down as a result, right? The whole business goes out of business because of my bad software. What have I really accomplished? So I think over time, the risks have shifted. They're different. When you put everything in the cloud, you become a much more attractive target, but you also can rely on the experts and the expertise of companies like Microsoft or Google, where they have a vested interest in protecting that stuff. And if you understand security fundamentals and you know how to use their tools to configure your environment, because a lot of breaches that happen in the cloud really are not the cloud provider's fault. It's misconfiguration, right? It's people not understanding how to use the tools to correctly configure their environment that causes these breaches. If you know that going in, I think the cloud gives you the opportunity to create more secure apps. But the flip side of that is, for an application that you build in a flat client that only ran inside a corporate firewall, right, inside their perimeter, how much security do you have to worry about there? Not nearly as much as, even though it might be the same corporate people, it's exposed to the world potentially, right, through these cloud services. So the risks are different. The attack surface is different. It's a different problem, but I think you can actually be more secure if you approach it the right way.
You mentioned those high profile cases and we're seeing this a lot, right? We're seeing schools, the pipeline, we're seeing everything. I mean, everything, even Peloton, right? There's security risks. Yeah. So why then, right? And you kind of talked about the difference between the cloud and not the cloud is my best engineering term. But why are we seeing such an influx? What is it that, what's changed? Has anything changed? That's my real question. What's changed?
Yeah, Nicola, I think a lot of things have changed. And I think the timing for these kinds of attacks is right on a lot of fronts. First off, as a result of the pandemic, we've seen a lot of digital transformation, right? People who were working in what I'm going to call a secure corporate environment behind a firewall and updates and all that sort of stuff, in many cases were forced to very quickly figure out how to be productive somewhere else, their home or somewhere else, right? So now you're taking their devices that were running in a relatively secure environment and you're throwing them into your home environment. You got your kids there. They might be trying to use the same devices. You've got a small home office type router there that's certainly not going to be as secure as a corporate firewall. Maybe you're not installing updates. There's just, all these things happening in your remote environment that make it less secure. You've got people trying to use new tools they've never used before, Slack, Teams, Zoom, et cetera. A lot of the Zoom bombing stuff, and Zoom has a, let's just say, spotty record on privacy and security at best. And, a lot of it, though, is because people don't really understand how to configure the tool and didn't use the security features it provided, and that's often the case with a lot of this. So I think you have people trying to do new things, people trying to use new tools, in many cases forced to do it because of the pandemic. They don't have the training, they don't have the expertise, they don't really understand how to configure it. And then the flip side of that is, too, I think you have, cyber crime has become an epidemic. You have bad guys all over the world, many of whom who are essentially outside the reach of U.S. law enforcement. They're in countries where, at best, there's no extradition policy. Maybe the government turns a blind eye to their actions, or at worst, the government is actually behind in facilitating their actions. They're making enormous amounts of money. The dark side gang that was responsible for the Colonial Pipeline attack claims to have made $90 million in 10 months. Wow. And so far, what have been the repercussions to most of these ransomware gangs? Nothing, right? They're never prosecuted. There's no penalty whatsoever in most cases. And then you throw into the fact you've got encryption, you've got cryptocurrency. It's never been easier to launch attacks, cover your tracks, make it difficult to find you, even if you are somewhere where you can't be touched. And then you've got everyone spending more time online, using technology in new and different ways, doing more with technology, putting more sensitive and valuable data into electronic form that might have not, might have been in paper form, or at least behind that corporate firewall. So I think you literally have a perfect storm of all these different things happening, and the pandemic just rapidly accelerated all of this stuff.
Right.
And also the bad guys know that regular non-nerds don't want to know about all this crap. They just want to live their lives and do their job. They don't want to have to care about all this stuff, right? And they know that people continue to do things like use bad passwords and use the same passwords. So I really think it's a perfect storm. And, it's all converged. And unfortunately, until there are more consequences for these folks or people start to take this more seriously, I think it's only going to get worse before it gets better.
So, I'm sorry, Brian.
No, you can ask your question, Nicola.
So you mentioned moving, the corporate firewall and moving remote, right? So would there be something that could be implemented like, let's say a company has decided to go fully remote, are there certain practices that that company could put into place then to kind of replicate that corporate firewall in a remote environment?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, one of the things I hope we can cover here before we're done is there's a lot of simple, in many cases, free, concrete things you as an individual and you as a small business where you may not have access to a lot of nerds like me can do to protect your assets. But to answer your question specifically, you could use a virtual private network, a VPN. An enterprise strength VPN is going to be pretty secure, assuming it's configured right. And for your non-nerds out there, a VPN is essentially an encrypted channel between your computer and your office. So when someone needs to connect to office resources remotely, they're going through this encrypted channel. Again, assuming it's set up correctly, it's very secure. Another approach would be, I'm going to take some or all of those assets that people need access to, and I'm not going to give them access to those assets through the corporate firewall. I'm going to put them into a cloud-based solution. I'm going to use something like Citrix ShareFile, or I'm going to use Microsoft SharePoint, where they have good security. There's encryption involved in that. And now you still, though, get back to people making bad human judgment, like I used the same password on all my accounts, and you hacked my Gmail account, which is the same password as my work account, and now you can get into the share file, or you can hack my VPN or whatever. So, yeah, there are concrete steps organizations can take to certainly reduce that risk, but a lot of it's going to come back to education and training for the users and trying to help them understand the risks and not make these common mistakes. Nerds like me like to say, nothing is going to be perfect. Nothing is infallible. It's an asymmetric battle. The defenders have to defend every possible hole, every single conceivable thing. The bad guys only need to find one flaw, right, that they can exploit. And when you're dealing with a nation state actor like Russia or China, they literally have unlimited time and unlimited resources to find those holes. So you're never going to come up with a perfect solution, but what you can do is focus on risk and how to make yourself a much more difficult target so that unless you are explicitly targeted, the bad guys will move on, right? That you're too hard to hack, they'll move on to a softer target. And that's not that hard to do or that costly in most cases.
So now, we talked about things like Peloton, right?
Yep.
And we see a lot, it's not new, but we've seen a lot of security built into sort of like the chip level pieces of that. So as more and more smart devices or, connected home type things get online, are we going to see a lot more security based on at the chip level versus at sort of these other levels where you're talking about tools or VPNs or even cloud-based? Because, we've seen a lot of that designed into chips, over the last few years.
I think the answer is yes, but I think that's a long haul. One of the reasons why we're in the fix we're in is because when you go back and you look at the technology that underpins all this stuff, really TCP/IP and some of these more fundamental networking technologies that make this stuff work, they were designed decades ago when security was not a thing, right? And no one envisioned how all of this would be used. So what you see is security is not designed into these things. We're trying to retrofit it on. We're trying to make it do things it wasn't really designed to do. And a lot of these flaws and holes pop up because of just the inherent nature of the way these things work. So building this stuff into the chip level is probably ultimately the way to go. But even that has its own set of problems because right now we have a chip shortage. There's concern. There's some very interesting articles out there about, who's making these chips. Could they have backdoors in them that could be, circumvented? So you need to have a very stringent quality control process around that and, have a trust initiative around the chip makers themselves if you take it to that level. But, the Internet of Things for me, so I don't know if either one of you two are familiar with Mikko Hyppinen. He's the CTO of F-Secure. They're a fairly well-known antivirus / endpoint protection company. He's a well-known dude. He does a lot of public speaking, very interesting, writes a lot about security. And I guess it was maybe a year and a half or so ago, before everything shut down, he was at a conference and we was discussing the Internet of Things, smart devices, smart home, whatever you want to call it. And he basically likened it to asbestos. And I think his summary of this is perfect. He's like, when asbestos first came out, everyone thought it was this great miracle material, right? And we put it in everything because we thought it was great. And then over time realized maybe this isn't so great, right? It's got some significant health, creates health issues and so forth. And his point with the IoT is we've got all these devices being rushed out. People don't really understand the risks that they create. They don't understand how to secure them correctly. They don't really know how to configure them. They're insecure out of the box. The IoT is the asbestos of today. And I couldn't agree with you more, because you mentioned Peloton. We could probably spend the rest of our time just outlining problems with IoT devices. If your viewers go out and look, I mean, you can find countless real world examples of IoT devices that have been hacked. All kinds of theoretical stuff, like, a guy who went and got a coffee maker and decided to hack it and do all kinds of weird stuff. And it's a twofold threat, really. It's the, can I hack your device X, your doorbell, your refrigerator, whatever that is, to get access to whatever information it might contain? Now, if you know how many mustards I used last month, I probably don't care. But if you could potentially listen to sensitive conversations that I had with my attorney about trade secrets or something, I would care about that, right? But it's not just the privacy implications, it's the security implications of so many of these IoT devices get rushed to market. Security is an afterthought at best. They're insecure out of the box. People do not know how to configure them. People don't understand how to update the software in them when updates come out. And in many cases, there's not even really a user interface. So unless you're a nerd, you don't even know how to get to the place where you'd update.
Yeah, most people don't even know what BIOS is or their firmware or anything like that.
If firmware might as well be, you might as well call it Umama Doo Banana Patch or something.
Right.
They don't know. They don't know what that is. And I get it. Again, that's not a negative statement about people. It's, people want to, they don't want to be nerds, right? But we're throwing these devices in with little thought given to the security and privacy concerns they create. And, once you plug it into your network, your home network, where you're now using your work devices to work remotely, the bad guys can use a search engine like Shodan, find your device, figure out that, oh, wait, look, you didn't change the default password that I can look up from D-Link or Amazon or whomever. Right. They realize it's got flaw X or whatever. They access that device, and then they use that to eventually work their way into your PC and then perhaps into your corporate network, and at which point all bets are off. So as you can tell, I'm not overly bullish on the IoT. And yes, I have no Alexas. I have none of that sort of stuff. Not because I think they're inherently bad, but because I think the stuff is still way immature and it's just not worth the risk to me.
Right.
So then being on both sides of the fence then, well, not really, it's not really different sides of the fence, but kind of that transition, right? What would you then say, given your experience, what would you then say engineers should be thinking about as they're designing things?
Well, hopefully, as a result of all these high profile hacks, I'm hoping you're going to see sort of a sea change in the thinking from the executive level on down, because, like any professional, developers only know what they know, right? And if they're getting pressure from their boss and their management structure to get something done on time, even if it might ship with security flaws in it, right? Or if it hasn't been appropriately tested for security issues and so forth, then, most of them, that's what they're going to do. And in many cases, I can tell you from my own experience, they don't receive training around security, which is sad because there's all kinds of great resources out there like the OWASP Top 10. But when you look at that, I think it proves my point. One of the common flaws you see show up every couple of years when they revamp their list of the top 10 application type flaws out there, it's things like SQL injection. SQL injection has been a problem with websites for at least 2 decades, right? I mean, it's a well-known problem, and to a large extent, it's very easy to address. But
can we tell Nicolette what that is?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Brian.
Oh, I was going to say, it's basically when someone hacks a website and they inject basically code or whatever, or redirects whatever they want into your SQL database.
Which could do something like delete all your data or extract all your data from it. So I go to your website, you have a web form, I start entering data in that form, like, it asks for my name and, whatever information you want to collect. Well, if the site's not built correctly, I could go in there and do something like type semicolon, drop table customer semicolon, and just see what happens. Now, if your database engine protection layer software isn't built right, it will literally attempt to execute that command. And even if that command doesn't work, if I get an error message, I know right off the bat, you're not set up right. And with enough hacking, I'm eventually going to be able to exfiltrate data from your site. Again, this has been a known thing for at least 20 years, and yet it still shows up year after year on their top 10 list. So that's what I mean about developers, programmers, engineers. not necessarily being focused on or getting the training they need. But I'm hoping, again, with these high-profile attacks and businesses starting to get serious black eyes, things like the California Consumer Privacy Act, GDPR out of the EU, other states that are looking at laws like CCPA, where now the onus will eventually be on companies, and they'll have potentially huge fines as a result of these kind of breaches. They'll be forced to take these kind of things seriously. And engineers will start to pay attention. Hopefully they'll start to get the training they need. And the focus will be on, yeah, we got to get this done, and we got to get it done by a certain date, and we got to get it done within a certain budget. But the date and the budget are not as important as putting out software that isn't going to either A, put me out of business when I roll it out because it's full of flaws, or B, put my customers who are buying it from me out of business because it's full of flaws.
Right.
But I don't think that's been the focus for many software vendors for a long time. I mean, the big guys, sure, the Microsofts and the Oracles of the world. But, you know, you've got many smaller companies out there making all kinds of software. And as a guy who owned his own business for 12 years, building custom software, I can tell you, for most of that time, security was certainly not my foremost goal.
Do you think also too, especially with the advent, I mean, if you talk about, you know, we talked about sort of the golden age of computers, right? You'd buy a piece of software and you couldn't really update it, you know, so it had to be perfect, right? It had to be perfect coming out of the box. And now with all these updates, I mean, we saw this with, you know, especially the gaming industry was notorious for this, releasing games that had major bugs in them. But because you could update them, it was okay to push out the release date, right? So do you think a lot of the development happens where they're pushing out things where, I don't want to say they're necessarily known bugs, but they're a little less secure about things because they know they can push out updates?
Those aren't bugs, Brian. Those are undocumented features. You know, to be honest with you, I never really looked at it from that perspective. But yeah, that's probably part of it because, to your point, in the old days, you know, I would go to a store, I would buy a box, it would have 30 discs in it. It would take me an hour and a half to install from all those discs. And yeah, it had to be more or less, at least like an 80-20 thing, right? Now I can roll something out, and if it's full of bugs, yeah, I can, you know, I can know something is going to ship with certain bugs in it. Hope users don't find those and patch it at some later point. So I hadn't thought about that, but I think that's a good point, and it probably does play into the sort of at least more lax approach to putting stuff out that may not be quite ready.
Because you think about it, like everything, I mean, it's not even just software. You install a piece of software, it's updating. It's almost automatically updating, right? You buy a piece of hardware, whether it's an IoT device or something else, and it's automatically going and getting the newest patch or the newest firmware or the newest driver or whatever it is in order to update itself, where you didn't have that, you know, whatever, a decade and a half ago.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, I can tell you, I've been in a situation where we sent out updates on CDs, you know, and it'd be 30 days before the thing would show up in the mail or whatever. So yeah, I think that's an interesting perspective. Hadn't thought about that before. It probably cuts both ways. Yeah, it is easier to get those updates when you need them and to get them in a timely fashion, but it certainly would make it easier for someone to ship something that they know isn't quite right. I'm hoping, though, that, you know, as we see things like CCPA come on and more focus being paid around security and why it's important, thanks to these high-profile attacks, that, you know, again, security will become more of a, it'll be focused on and it'll be designed in. You know, they'll say, maybe not the most important thing, but it's at least equally important to functionality and everything else. Security is a must. We can't put out software that's ultimately going to shut our business down or shut our customers down. And when you look at the societal impact of these infrastructure type attacks, you know, this is, again, I don't want to put my tinfoil hat on. Yes, they did actually make a tinfoil hat for me at the office. I don't want to put that on too much, but, you know, as society is increasingly dependent on technology, right? All these plants. So I'm an old guy. I'm old enough to remember the Bhopal disaster in India when thousands of people were killed because of a chlorine release. If I could hack your plant that's making chlorine and open a valve that shouldn't be opened or something, and when people say, well, that's far-fetched, A, look at the Oldsmore water plant. Here's a recent example in Florida where hackers were able to exploit bad passwords, unpatched software, et cetera, to get in and change the composition of the chemicals going into the water to the point they could have hurt people had someone not caught that in time. We have concrete example of this was Stuxnet. You know, the attack on Iran, where we messed with their centrifuges and they basically blew themselves apart because the software was sending back bad data to the operators and they didn't realize that the machines were running out of tolerance. So, I mean, there are concrete examples of this in the real world where you can launch digital attacks on physical equipment that intertwines with the physical world that can have impacts in the physical world. You know, I don't lose sleep at night, but I worry about this a lot. And it's this kind of thing that made me decide to try to get out of the engineering side of this and work more on just the general cybersecurity side, because, you know, people's businesses are being destroyed, people's lives are being destroyed. And as we depend more and more on technology in the physical world, there is the possibility of kinetic action that kills people in the real world as a result of either flaws or attacks on these plants and equipment and such.
So cyber wars is actually more than just a virtual or digital war. I mean, it could be a very physical war. I never thought of it like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, if you're a nation state actor and you want to launch an attack on your adversary, and I think also, again, going back to this concept of asymmetry, the United States is a lot more dependent on technology than probably any other country in the world. If you fly over North Korea at night, you know, take a look at the map, there's like one candle burning there. You can't really shut down their grid, right? They don't have the same kind of reliance on technology that we do. So, you know, when people say, well, we should hack back and we should do this, that, or the other, if you launch an attack on me, first off, it can be difficult to attribute who is actually behind the attack if they're any good. And secondarily, okay, if I shut down the power grid in Russia, will that have the same impact on Russia that it will in the United States? I predict that it will not, because we're a lot more reliant on all this technology now. So, you know, that's one of the problems of it. But then also, and again, this gets a little futuristic, but as we get more autonomous cars and that sort of thing, you know, there's a very interesting article from The Atlantic maybe 3 or 4 years ago called The Coming Software Apocalypse. And it sort of approaches it from not only the cyber attack, cyber crime aspect, but human beings, guys like me who are just humans, they make mistakes, write software. The software has bugs. It fails sometimes, not because of some malicious attack, just because it's a bug, right? So imagine if you're a criminal, a cyber criminal, you know, nation state actor of some sort, and you could hack some brand of autonomous car. We'll just go with Tesla. Everyone knows Tesla. Okay, if I could say at 5 o'clock on Friday or 4:55 on Friday at rush hour, every Tesla or every Tesla Model X or every Chevy, whatever, just accelerate. Just accelerate, you know, and until you can't accelerate anymore. Okay, you've literally created thousands, possibly tens of thousands of missiles that are just going to drive into something, probably killing the occupant, doing who knows what kind of damage. Could you target those? Could you say, okay, I know there are these types of plants in this area. I want all of these things to drive into it. I mean, it sounds far-fetched. There's plenty of evidence that this is within the realm of possibility. I would encourage your viewers to check out a story that was in Wired. Two reporters, or I guess a reporter and two guys took a Jeep Grand Cherokee out in like 2015, hacked it remotely. They could control the brakes. They could control virtually everything in that vehicle. It caused a gigantic recall from Chrysler to fix these things. So again, you know, these things will happen. They'll get some attention, then they kind of get tamped down. But I think over time, as more people become aware of these things, they're going to start putting pressure on the companies that make this stuff. They're going to put pressure on their legislators. And hopefully you'll see more regulation around this stuff so that when these things happen, it's not like, oh, well, sorry, Nicolette, your data got hacked. Tough for you. You know, the onus as the person with your data will be on me. So I will have more incentive to ensure that doesn't happen. And particularly these real world attacks.
Right. Never thought of this. Is very interesting.
It's depressing. Usually, you know, Doomsday Dave. Usually, I just cast a pall over everyone that I talk to because the deeper you get into this,
there's a whole bunch of people watching that just unplugged Alexa.
Yeah. Alexa, throw yourself in the garbage.
Right. It may actually turn on over here. I don't know.
Well, let me ask you then, Anna, let's go positive, right? Okay, so what can we do? What's in our control then? And I know you alluded to this earlier, you know, kind of sharing this information with us. What can we do? What can we do?
The good news is there is a lot of things you can do. And I would say, first off, by just taking advantage of enormous amounts of free information and nerds like me out there who are trying to raise awareness about this stuff and help you understand that you're not too small to be a target. the information you have or have access to is valuable. People will say, I mean, I've heard this a million times. I'm too small. My company's too small. I don't have anything of value. Well, why would you attack me? Well, here's a concrete example. I'm a company in Cincinnati called Cincinnati Hoist and Crane. The business owner actually made a video. I got enormous respect for this guy. His name's Tony Strovel. He was hit with a business email compromise attack. They got into his email. They figured out who he was doing business with and eventually sent out fraudulent invoices that looked exactly like his real invoices, but with their bank account information on it. He lost about $250,000 over the course of several months because, of course, until it seemed like customers weren't paying, there was no issue there, right? The customers are getting what appear to be real invoices. They're paying them. The money's going somewhere else. Eventually, he goes around to collect and says, hey, like, where's my money? They're like, what do you mean? We paid you. Again, he lost about $250,000, had to lay off about 25% of his workforce, almost put him out of business. And again, the guy has a lot of courage. He made a video kind of saying, hey, I was the guy who said, I'm too small. I got nothing to steal. This could never happen to me, but it did happen to me. And here's what you need to know so it doesn't happen to you. So to answer your question specifically, A, being aware that these things are happening every day and they are targeting small companies and individuals because, yeah, you don't have deep pockets like, let's say, Kroger or P&G or somebody. But if I can steal $250,000, that's a pretty good haul, right? That's a lot of money to most people wherever you are in the world, especially if you can amplify that across dozens or hundreds of companies. So, it's awareness. And then it's doing simple things like doing what all the nerds say not do. Don't use the same password, right? Have a strong, unique password for every account. Everyone says, oh my God, it gives me password anxiety. Now I've got more applications and more sites and I'm doing all this stuff online now. I need all these passwords. Well, that's true. And it certainly doesn't eliminate the advice to have a strong password, but here's what you can do. A, if you don't want to use a password manager, which I'll come back to, then use a passphrase. Come up with a passphrase like, I love pizza with onions, or anchovies are my favorite on ice cream, or whatever. Come up with a phrase that only you would know, right? And use a unique phrase for every account. It'll be much easier to remember. And the main thing with passwords is the longer they are, the harder they are to crack. So if you say, I love pizza with onions, right? Replace the O with a 0, replace the E with a 3, you will create a long phrase that will be very difficult to crack, but easy for you to remember. So that's one way to get around the password reuse issue because, we see these huge dumps. The RockU 2021 dump, 8.4 billion credentials in there. The Comb dump had over 3 billion. Bad guys have all of this information. If you're using the same password, and they get it anywhere, well, then they're into all your accounts, maybe your work accounts, your bank, whatever. So you got to have a strong, unique password for every account. A passphrase is better, but the best thing you can do, frankly, is use a password manager. There are any number of excellent and in many cases free password managers out there. Things like LastPass, Keeper, Dashlane, there's a bunch of them. And I'm going to throw out this general advice for any sort of software that you might be thinking about using. And when I say software, I'm using that term loosely. Apps for your phone, for your tablets, software applications for your PC. A lot of these things are essentially thinly veiled spyware at best. It's a surveillance capitalism model. These things are, quote, free because you are not the customer, you are the product. They're making their money off your data. That's not necessarily bad, but you need to understand that going in. But some of these things, and Google and Apple have both removed many, many apps from their store, are essentially spyware or worse. They're viruses, right? So if you just say, I heard nerdy old Dave Hatter say, get a VPN, get a this, get a that, and you go search and you download the first thing you come across, chances are you're not going to get something that is helpful and perhaps malicious, right? So here's what you can do. When you hear nerds like me say, do this, do that, get this, go to a site like CNET or ZDNet or Tom's Guide or Consumer Reports, where they have editors and they have experts that rank this stuff, right? They vet it, they tear it apart, they determine if it's any good or not. So with a password manager, if you go to CNET and you search for best password manager, and you go to ZDNet and you go to Tom's Guide and you search for best password manager, what I predict you will find is every site will rate them every year. And you'll see 3 or 4 that come up in the top 5 on every site. LastPass is typically 1, Dashlane is typically 1, Keeper is typically one of those that gets in the top 5 of each one. Use a password manager, and then all you have to do is have one really strong passphrase for your password manager. come up with one ridiculously hard to crack passphrase as the master password for your password manager. Put all your passwords in there. If it's a secure password manager like LastPass, which is what I personally use and what we use as a business and recommend, it uses what's known as a zero knowledge model. It encrypts your passwords before it goes to their server, so even they don't know what your password is. So unless someone can get your master password, even if they get the database of passwords from LastPass, doesn't do them any good because they're all encrypted.
Right.
So, and with a password manager like LastPass, it's going to make it easy for you to create and strong, unique passwords for all of your accounts. It makes it easy to change those if you need to. You can typically run the password manager on your PC, your phone, your tablet. So no matter where you're trying to log in from, you have access to those passwords. And even though it'll create a little friction in your life when you first try to figure out how to use it, I promise you, in the long run, it will make your life a lot better because it will make your accounts very difficult to crack because you can create literally a 256 character random password. I mean, the sun will burn out before someone can crack that, okay? So that's one thing. The next thing to do, and these are closely coupled together, use multi-factor authentication, also known as two-factor authentication or two-step verification, depending on whose platform you're on. That's the thing, and my guess is most of your viewers have experienced this. A lot of banks force you to use this now. You go to log in, you enter your credentials, your username and password, and then it prompts you for typically a 6-digit one-time passcode that resets every 30 seconds or so. So you'll have 30 seconds and it'll want you to enter that code. That code is typically either sent to you via text to your phone or better yet, an authenticator app, something like Authy or the Google Authenticator or the Microsoft Authenticator. These are apps you can install on your phone, and it adds an extra layer of security because it is possible to hack the SMS network and get those codes. Someone could SIM swap you, so the codes get sent to a different phone. With the Authenticator app, it's tied to your phone. They have to be able to unlock your phone and physically possess the phone to get that code. But Google and Microsoft, independent of one another, have said multi-factor authentication alone, just by itself, will block 99% of all automated attacks. So if you have a strong password, if you're using a password manager where it's easy to change that password, if there's any sort of indication that it's been hacked, breached, whatever, and you're using multi-factor authentication on your accounts, even if they get your password, they still have to have that one-time passcode that's coming to your phone. That's what I mean by making yourself a harder target. You're not impenetrable. There are workarounds for this that have been demonstrated, but unless you are being specifically targeted by like a nation state actor, you know, the bad guys will move on to a softer target. The two things I just mentioned here are free. Doesn't cost you anything to use MFA, and you can get a free password manager that will, that will do everything you need to do and keep you secure. I throw into the bucket then probably the third most important thing: install software updates. Many of these high-profile hacks we're seeing are either due to compromised passwords or unpatched software or some combination of both. If you have Windows, if you have a Mac, if you have an Android phone, you've got to install the software patches for these things. While you're probably less likely to get hit as a result of a software vulnerability, it's happening all the time. The password thing is the simplest, best thing you can do in conjunction with MFA. But if you're not installing the updates on your devices, your IoT devices, your computers, et cetera, you are literally just asking to get hacked. Costs nothing to do this. Now, again, as Brian mentioned, it's not always obvious how to do it. In some cases it can be automated. You're going to have to understand for any specific device you have how to do that. But there's tons and tons and tons of free resources and nerds like me all over the internet explaining this stuff, right? But you need to know you need to do it, and then you can go out and find help for how to get it done. If you just do those three things, and I could go on and on and on this stuff, but if you just do those three things, you're going to be a much, much harder target, and the bad guys are going to move on to find the softer target down the road, right? It's not worth them investing the energy to try to crack these things.
Right. Well, I mean, those are easy things that we can all start doing right now. So
easy and free, costs you nothing.
Easy and free. That
maybe a little time and probably a little frustration, because sometimes these things get aggravating, but
not nearly as frustrating as when your data gets stolen, right?
Or you find that your bank account has been wiped out.
Exactly.
Or your photos that you would rather not have been published to the internet are now on Facebook.
Fair enough.
Long laundry list of these things, right?
Well, that's inspiration enough. I think I think we should all take Dave's advice into account and really consider it, especially everything that's going on. So I appreciate you coming on and talking to us about this very important topic, very timely topic. And Brian, do you have any other questions for Dave?
No, just where can people find out more about you, Dave?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it. I do appreciate the opportunity to scare the crap out of people. And yeah, I mean, I'm happy to help. Probably the best way to find me, you can go to the Intrust website, intrust-it.com, or, I have a fairly substantial presence on LinkedIn or Twitter. I encourage people to follow me on Twitter because I follow all kinds of various security-related accounts. And, I'm constantly trying to share as much security-related information as possible. There's a plethora of information out there that will help people if you just know where to find it. And again, if you follow me on Twitter, at Dave Hatter, I'm constantly sharing this stuff and trying to help raise people's awareness and protect themselves. Because yes, the bad guys are out to get you. They really are.
Well, thank you, Dave.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We appreciate it.
Unfortunately, they're bad and they're smart and they're evil.
I love it. We need a little realism in the world, right? So thank you.
My pleasure. Sorry to be such a downer.